Hello, and welcome from Oxford North American office in New York City. I hope you all are well. My name is Allison Russell, and I'm the Associate Vice President for the Mathematical, Physical, and Life Sciences Division here in the United States. Thank you all for joining today's Q&A. Is the future of transport electric? With Professor Tim Schwanen. Oxford is pleased to use this virtual forum to spotlight leading academics who are on the forefront of understanding the multitude of causes driving climate change, as well as the necessary interventions and solutions that will most effectively and efficiently promote change. Tim is one of those thought leaders whose research concentrates on the geographies of everyday mobilities of people, goods, and information. His work is international in outlook and interdisciplinary in scope. For the past 5 years, he has focused on the electrification of transportation and how best to respond to the climate crisis. Tim is director of Oxford's Transport Studies Unit, professor of Transport Studies in the School of Geography and Environment, and a fellow at St. Anne's College. Okay, quick overview of the event. Tim will give a short presentation, then we move on to the Q&A. Thank you very much to everyone who submitted questions ahead of time. Tim has reviewed them and will answer them first. We put them into categories. If you have questions during the event, please just submit them into the Q&A box. We will do our best to address them while also keeping an eye on the time. With that, it is a great pleasure and honor to hand it over to Tim. Tim?
Thank you very much, Alison. And hello, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many of you are attending today. I've prepared some slides that I will use for my introductory talk. And as you can, well, the question, is the future of transport electric, is a tricky one to answer. I don't have a crystal ball, of course, but I can tell you that electrification is going to be very important, although perhaps not as important as some of the most dedicated enthusiasts sometimes think. Next slide, please. On first sight, electrification is finally taking off. These are graphs produced by the International Energy Agency, and they show very rapid growth, exponential growth that is set to continue quite some time into the future. And what we see is that the growth is particularly large in certain segments of the market. It's mostly conventional cars. What you can see on the right-hand side is that vans and trucks are much slower. We see some development in buses, but it's predominantly conventional cars. Next slide, please. If we look at that geographically, then we see some marked changes. We see that China has for some time been the global leader. That role is now taken over by Europe. And we see within Europe, some countries consistently ahead of others. Norway is really the way ahead of the curve. They are now at almost 80% of new cars being electric. And we see Sweden and the Netherlands also doing very well. Interestingly, the US is lagging behind, as you can see, and is actually not showing that much growth. Part of that is because in recent years, the number of new vehicles in total that have come on the road have declined, which sort of is depressing it. But yeah, there's some interesting geographical differences here. Next slide, please. And I think part of that is because we see momentum in some places more than in others. What we see particularly in Europe and China is that a number of self-reinforcing trends have come up. Specifically in Europe, we see that the combination of lower costs and greater choice has been accompanied by governments really adopting stimulating measures. So tax incentives, financial incentives, a lot of support for charging infrastructure. And we see that that has sort of altogether, it's really self-reinforcing to the extent that manufacturers are now really worried about being left behind. So they're putting out many more new vehicles and models on the market. And we see amongst consumers also strong imitative behavior coming into existence. All of these processes have been intensified and enabled by wider public concern, especially over air quality and especially the health implications of that. And what is, I think, the most powerful sets of news about air quality is about what it can do to the development of healthy children, development of lungs, brains in particular, and of course the whole climate debate plays into this as well. In Europe, we've seen a proliferation of low emission zones in cities. The UK has many plans and has actually many of these zones in development, for instance. And one of the most robust strategies for not only consumers, but also for firms and other organizations that have fleets is to shift to electric vehicles, because then you're whatever local condition is in place, you always can access every place that you want to go. And the final factor that is really important in this is that when we often talk about vehicle ownership, but in many instances, we're actually talking about people leasing their vehicle, quite often on relatively short contracts of 3 or 5 years, which means that people are less long locked into a particular vehicle, and it's easier to shift than it was at the time in earlier decades, where there was much more ownership by individuals and households. Next slide, please. So all of that looks good, but we also see a lot of issues around electric vehicles, EVs. One is that we see they are predominantly vehicles for well-to-do households, and that's not going to change anytime soon. So all kinds of social inequalities that are existing in transport are being reinforced around electric vehicles. I'm sure many of you are also aware of how electric vehicles require particular metals, and that is driving a new wave of extractivism of particular metals in particular places. So if we're thinking about cobalt, which is very important for batteries, the #1 site in the world for extracting cobalt is the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's not only sort of issues of the environmental cost, but also a very fragile political situation. There were similar questions around lithium and a number of other scarce metals that are sort of driving a whole new wave of geopolitics. I've already mentioned that vans and trucks are very difficult to electrify, and that those are issues that are difficult to address. Especially trucks are really, really difficult, as are all kinds of, as is aviation, which is where the fastest growth in CO2 emissions is happening across the world, including the US. And then we have to think really about which problems electric vehicles actually solve. And in some ways, it's fair to say that they're good for air quality, they're good for CO2 emission reduction, as long as the energy that, or the electricity that goes into them is clean. But electric vehicles will not help us deal with other problems like congestion, like inactive lifestyles and obesity, like urban sprawl. All these kinds of issues are still ongoing. They're sort of tied to the technology of the private vehicle and not so much to the drivetrain is in it. So EVs are good for some aspects, but there are many things that they don't solve, which means, next slide, that we need to, sorry, next slide, that we need to look at a wider range of interventions in transport systems. And the most widely used framework for that in policy circles is what you see here, the avoid, shift, and improve framework, that the best thing to do is to avoid any need for motorized travel. If that's not possible, we're going to shift the mobility to more sustainable modes. And if that doesn't work, then we try to improve those vehicular motorized modes of transport. And you can see different examples of what can be done here, but it's quite clear if you look at these that we can't solve transport issues by only looking at transport of itself. We will need to think about how transport ties into land use and urban planning. So we need to plan our cities around transit systems, known as transit-oriented development. We need to think about transport in conjunction with IT and digital services. And the pandemic has perhaps been a game changer in this regard, because working from home is now much more common and much more widely accepted than it was even 2 years ago. But we'll have to think about digital mobility, as we call it, and physical mobility in conjunction with one another. Of course, we need to do more in public transport, more cycling, more walking. We also need to think about our vehicles. And in the short term, it is not only about different drivetrains, different energy sources, it is also about moving towards smaller vehicles and going against the long-term trend of extending the size and the weight of vehicles and putting more gadgets into them. In the short term, small vehicles are really important as well. And if we do all of these things, then we might have some chance of reducing transport's impact on the environment. However, and we're now moving to my final slide, it's also important to be cautious about technological optimism in transport, because in fact, the sector has a pretty poor track record when it comes to technological change. We've had many waves of hype and very inflated interest in new vehicle technologies. We've been talking about battery electric vehicles, for instance, at least since the 1990s, and we're only now seeing that change happening. The same will also hold for hydrogen vehicles, which are currently sort of back in swing. There's a new hype emerging around these forms of vehicles. And I think we should be really careful with these. And yes, we're moving towards electrification, but we will also need to change behavior. We will need to move around and limit our mobility collectively and individually. That's not a popular message, but if we really want to diminish transport's contribution to climate change, then there's no way around it, unfortunately. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That's a super overview. And I am so pleased that you really, the way the arc of your talk really emulates a lot of the questions that came in ahead of time. So we can almost sort of look at the different slides, and might ask that maybe you can bring them up when we go through the categories that we have ahead of us. So again, just really want to thank everyone. There was a great, really wonderful questions. We'll do our best. We're going to use one or two to sort of prompt the categories that we're going to address now. Again, enter others into the Q&A. So, Jim, I think maybe even if looking at the technological, and almost starting with that last slide, if we could really talk through the technicality of some of these, you know, as you're saying, the technological optimism and the interest and investment in these areas for electric cars, or not just EVs, but also hydrogen vehicles. So if you could first talk about, I'm going to read one from the adoption of EV. So let's first start there. Someone wrote in, habits and range anxiety are a key barrier to individual adoption. Are there successful mitigation strategies? Now that's more macro, but I think it's even not the technological, but do you want to address that one first?
Sure. Range anxiety is a major issue, and it's significant issue, especially in the media. And there is some evidence that the vehicle industry, vehicle manufacturers have cultivated range anxiety as well. Individual drivers do have range anxiety, but the best remedy is actually giving them an electric vehicle and having them test it. So it's about building familiarity, because the vast majority of people will on a daily basis not drive more than the mileage that you normally have in an average electric vehicle. The mileage also goes up because the batteries are getting better, but most people will in normal situations not strand with a flat battery. So testing out, giving people vehicles for a couple of weeks to try out, those kinds of things have been shown. There's sort of academic evidence that these kinds of strategies work very well. So it's about getting used to driving these vehicles. That's very important. And I think there's also some mouth-to-mouth information is very important in this regard as well. So there's a process of normalization that needs to happen in this regard. So I think, yeah, giving people the opportunity to drive them for a short period is the most effective way.
And following on to that, will electric energy be as significant for transportation in less densely populated regions?
That's a really good question, because what we currently see is that it's in cities, high density locations, that electric vehicles are being driven the most. I think in the long term, we'll see that EVs are particularly important in more rural, low density settings, where it's much more difficult to provide other types of transport service. So public transport is much more difficult to provide. It's much more difficult to provide it in a way that's frequent and convenient for everyone. In those circumstances, I think we'll stick with a car-dependent form of transport, and then it's about cleaning up the emissions from the vehicle. Now, whether those vehicles will be individually owned, or whether some people believe they will be operated as robo-taxis. So that's effectively, you can think of that as an Uber without a driver. So vehicles that you order on your phone that come to you if and when you need them, and that you pay for on a pay-as-you-go basis. Many of my colleagues are very optimistic about this business model, this service model. I am much less optimistic, because I think people own cars not only because they drive or because they find it convenient, but because a car is so much more to many people. It is also part of your social identity and of how you see yourself and how you want to be seen by others. It is also about certain sets of emotions and feelings and having your own space. There's brilliant work done by colleagues focusing specifically on working mothers, for whom the commute is not as much of a hassle as it is often portrayed. That is not to say that working mothers love to commute. No, it is to say that in some circumstances, some people will have a very hectic life, both at work and home. The drive in the car is the only bit of me time that they have in the day. And I think that kind of sentiment is quite important as well, on top of the convenience, the practicalities that the car offers you, plus the whole question of identity. So I think, sort of as a social scientist and sort of looking at this through the lens of anthropology and sociology, that we're much more hooked into owning our vehicles than many transport experts suggest.
That's really helpful. And I think that's sort of leads into a couple of other categories that are the supporting infrastructure, that some questions are focused on. You know, this is what is it that within we live and that we get used to. So for charging, a few questions relating to charging and I guess convenience. How can we speed up the process for refueling for electric cars? And sort of following on to that, you know, what about more sites and recharging batteries along highways? So thinking about that supportive infrastructure, if you could talk a little bit about that. And there was another one, with more electric vehicles on the road, do you see charging infrastructure as plug to charge, battery swapping, or both?
Yeah, those are really good questions. They're heavily debated in the sort of amongst academics and amongst professionals working in this sector. I think the consensus is that when it comes to consumers and people like you and me, that we're moving towards charging rather than battery swapping. So there is going to be a need for public charging infrastructures, and they are being rolled out in most places as we speak. And I think part of the reason why we see such rapid growth in large parts of Europe in electrification have to do with governments putting a lot of money into public infrastructures or supporting the development of public infrastructures, because a lot of the infrastructure is, of course, developed and certainly operated by businesses. Now, being in electric vehicle charging is not an easy business. It's quite competitive with limited profit margins. And it'll be very interesting to see how that goes into the future, particularly in cities where a substantial part of households do not have off-street parking and do not have their own private space to charge their vehicles. So I think we will see more of a charging infrastructure developing, and key there is to think about interoperability, that we get infrastructure that where essentially whatever vehicle you have, you can charge everywhere. So there's a lot of emphasis being put on standardization of equipment, of course, but also payment systems and registration systems and what have you. And I think we'll see much more of that going forward. The question is whether infrastructure development, public infrastructure development for charging can keep up with the growth in demand. And that's going to be very interesting to see. I don't think you can give generic universal answers to that. I think that will really depend on where you are. I think what we do see is that there are going to be very interesting issues in terms of grid capacity. And in some places, simply the grid's capacity may not be there to charge large numbers of vehicles. So one of the interesting things with the shift towards electrification is that we see much closer interactions and entanglements of the transport and the energy sectors going forward. That is also very important, but difficult from a planning point of view, because the transport and energy infrastructure planning processes are completely siloed, completely separated. So there's a lot of institutional work that needs to be done to align these processes. And often we see that that is at least as challenging, if not more so, than the technical issues of getting the things to work. Many of the challenges regarding the electrification of transport are not technological. They are in terms of institutions, governance, and politics.
That actually, that was just, you addressed sorry, Tim, That's great, because everyone was immediately thinking about the electrical grid and supporting of that continuum. You grow, and so you did answer a couple, a few of those questions that were along those lines. Do you have a sense? Someone does say, I mean, just from your perspective, do you have a sense of where things stand? It sounds like it's being siloed, but is it? I know especially in North America, the grid unto itself is being addressed. And are you hearing about those plans in the UK and whatnot in terms of reevaluating grids to address the sustainability of EV?
Yeah, of course, this is a much broader set of questions than simply transport related questions. So because the whole grid needs to be reconfigured, and the grid itself needs to be decarbonized in many ways. And I think there are certainly technological issues here, but again, the institutional issues are just as significant, because you have different levels of government with different styles of working, different organizational cultures, different rules that all need to come together and that need to get aligned. And that turns out to be very challenging. So you've got what we call vertical fragmentation, where you've got different layers of government that are involved, and agencies at different levels of government. And then you've got the horizontal fragmentation, where you've got players at a given level in the energy sector and also in the transport sector. That all needs to be reworked, and that all needs to be realigned. And that process of reorganization is often more challenging than the technical issues that are being dealt with.
That's super, because I think that context of a few people had asked, key questions of timescales of the future. How long will it take to transition? And you're pointing to again, the social challenges are outweighing the actual technicality. How long will it take to? Someone mentioned to build the electric highways, and when will so when and how does that impact the world coming to cleaner transportation? Do you mind touching upon, there's some good questions on the limits of electrification. And I'll read off a few here. What types of vehicle, e.g. heavy vehicles, might electricity not work for, and why? What is the largest barrier for an electric vehicle future? So I'm just putting some out there, but it is interesting to sort of flip it over and come back to your point that you've been alluding to. But where and what are those limitations?
Yeah, I think trucks are a very big challenge still. You may have seen Elon Musk present his electric truck a couple of years ago. He's adamant that it can work. But I think there are a couple of issues. One is that the batteries have to be very large and are going to be very expensive. And that means that the whole vehicle itself will be very expensive, and far too expensive for many players in this market to purchase. Especially in Europe, we see that the HEV sector is a typical example of a fat-tailed distribution. You have a couple of very large companies, and then you have a very large number of very small companies. Essentially, they're owner-operators who drive their vehicle around. Those in particular will really struggle to move from diesel to electric. Because the price premium of a HEV that is electric will simply be far too large for their business. Their profit margins are very small. It's a very harsh life. It's a really tough business, and we'll see those people struggle very significantly, which creates some of these social inequalities, some of these equity issues I very briefly touched upon in my presentation as well, that I think we'll see many drivers, consumers households on small incomes really struggle to move towards electric vehicles. Electric vehicles remain cheaper, more expensive. That will take some time that will continue for some time into the future. And the second-hand market that is not yet as mature as we would like it to be. So there are types of vehicles that are difficult to electrify. There are groups in society that will struggle to switch to electrification. At the moment, electric vehicles are predominantly a middle-class phenomenon, and I don't think that will change anytime soon. Now, another type of transport where electrification is challenging is aviation. And again, there's lots of money being poured into solving these technological issues. And perhaps at some time in the future, we will find something that works. But again, business models are not of such nature that it's very easy for airlines to switch to electric planes if they were sort of fully operational and available on the market. At the same time, we do see a sort of a surge in very small unmanned vehicles. Unmanned aerial vehicles is a term that you see more and more of. Maybe those kinds of services, yes, people talk about sort of flying Uber taxis, which has been a bit of a hype pre-COVID. When journalists approached me for questions in 2019, I would say that 70% of those were about how long it would take before everyone would be flying around in Uber style of flying taxis. So they're definitely hyped. We may see some of those, but again, those will be predominantly for richer, more well-to-do individuals who already have a wide range of choices with regards to their transport, and not for most ordinary people, and certainly not for people on a limited income. So aviation, trucks are really challenging, and we see sort of huge social equity issues around electrification of transport as well.
Tim, if I could jump in on that note, just came in an interesting question about developing countries and inequities, and how, to that point, you know, how will electrification, which it's not as available in developing countries, can you speak a little bit about that divide and the gaps in adoption, or even just the ability? I mean, it's not even where it isn't. There are many socio and technological layers to that, but I thought it was timely that question just came in, so I'm putting that out there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question from Samuel, and it plays out differently in different parts of the world. If we look at India, we see that there is a push for electrification, but it's predominantly in the auto rickshaw sector and in the bus sector, much less so in private vehicles. I actually have one of the DPhil students, PhD students who I supervise, is looking into this process of electrification in India right now, is studying sort of the institutional dimensions of that. And I think it is partly to do with the very strong lobby of car manufacturers in India who are not particularly keen on switching to electrification, because it means that some of the investments they've made, the sunk investments of the last 10, 15 years, would not pay off. That's part of the explanation, not all of it, but part of it. I think what we see in Africa is slightly different. Depending on where you are in Africa, in Northern Africa, actually a lot of the vehicles that are being bought there come from elsewhere, come from Western Europe, or are being produced by local companies, depending on sort of histories and so on. There too, we don't see a lot of electrification happening as of yet. And actually, demand for vehicles in Africa and South Asia is growing so rapidly, that even if they moved fairly quickly to, say, a market share of electric vehicles of 50%, so 50% of new cars being electric, that would still mean that in terms of absolute number of cars, there would be many more internal combustion engine vehicles on the road, say 30 years from now, than we have at present, because the enormous growth in demand for vehicles is sort of still driving up that number of conventional cars. Latin America is better. Latin America is more positive, not everywhere, of course, but there are countries in Latin America where things are moving quite in the right direction. So it's a challenging, it's a geographically differentiated picture, but the overall problem that we have is that the total demand for vehicular travel, for motor vehicles, is growing very, very rapidly. And electric vehicle production cannot keep up with that. We see the same in aviation. All the technological measures that are currently available to reduce emissions are completely overwhelmed and cancelled out by the enormous growth in the demand for aviation on a global scale. And the pandemic has only delayed that. It's like a pause button on your video recorder or your CD player, if you still have those. It has sort of put things sort of on hold. It has not fundamentally altered the trajectory that we're on, which is this enormous growth in the demand for motorized, carbon-intensive transport, which is really problematic.
If you don't mind, I another question sort of that pertains to this, if I could just read it out. I think it's interesting in terms of the role of government and steering transportation towards desirable outcomes. How can government encourage use of the appropriate modality? So, you know, the short-term flights versus train. Do you have thoughts on that and you have the question so in front of you, but I thought that might be helpful if you continue on a little bit more about strategies that you think would work best.
Being in a liberal democracy is great because as citizens, you have lots of choices. But if you rapidly need to change your transport system to make it sustainable, it's a bit of a pain because you lack the means to essentially impose the draconian measures, as many would see them, that would be needed for that fast change. So it's really difficult to get people to change their behaviors and their purchasing decisions. So the best we can do is a combination of restrictive measures and more positive enabling measures. We call them carrots and sticks. You need the sticks, but you make them palatable with the carrots. So a classic example of this strategy is what London has done when it introduced the congestion charge. It made that palatable to people by promising that there would be vast investments in public transport and other forms of other forms of sustainable transport. And that has worked. But many cities subsequently trying to replicate that, not least Manchester and Edinburgh, it failed. It got voted away. It got voted away in referendums. And you can immediately see that in cultural contexts where notions of freedom are more strongly written into car use and car ownership than they are in a country like the UK, these restrictive measures will be very, very difficult. And in urban sprawl conditions that are built around the car, it is really difficult to get people to change their behavior, to change to other ways of moving around. So in many ways, for large parts of the US, electrification of cars is the only way forward. And then the question is, as I said previously, whether these cars will still be individually owned or whether we move towards a more Uber-style form of operating them, or a combination of both. So it's really difficult to get that behavior change in place. And unfortunately, our sector has a very poor track record in this regard, where there's actually a limited number of success stories that we keep returning to. So I've already mentioned road pricing in London. People talk about cycling in cities like Amsterdam, or urban rail in cities like Copenhagen. People talk about road pricing in Singapore. People talk about the excellent public transport in cities like Hong Kong. People talk about Curitiba when it is about sort of a global South context. Those are all very valid examples, but they are relatively limited in number, and they get recycled time and again. So we're really in for a very it's really a difficult situation that we're in. The transport systems are very difficult to change rapidly, unfortunately.
Well, I think that, that's true. So while we're I think before we go on with that, there's some interesting questions about hydrogen vehicles. So I give you one here. If we can extract hydrogen via solar power, why the move towards batteries?
Yeah, that's a very valid question, and I think the answer is that we don't have the time to wait for hydrogen vehicles to come onto the market. Change needs to happen in the next 5 years. Significant change needs to happen in the next 5 years. Hydrogen is on its way up again. I think I said that before, but it will take a long time before it becomes a commercially available and realistic alternative to what we got at the moment. What we will see is another round of demonstration projects and trials and tests. And that's very important. That needs to happen because we need to learn about how these technologies work out in practical situations. But we're not near commercial operation of these at the scale that would be required. So they are a long-term solution, especially for sectors where batteries are challenging. Like they may work really well in trucks, but not for the short time and not for the timescales we need to think of if we want to really reduce transport's contribution to climate change.
And another one came in. This is coming back and saying, what do you see forward? It's upcoming. You know, are there big improvements in battery technology that you are seeing coming down the pipeline? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a simple geographer. I'm a social scientist and not an engineer or a technologist. My understanding of this process is that we'll see a continued improvement of the battery technologies, but there's not a revolution on the horizon that can then sort of very rapidly be exploited commercially. So we essentially have to do with current technologies, which they will continue to improve in the way that the computers we use in our homes keep improving. but I don't think there's a radical shift to a new technology, new battery technology on the horizon for application at scale sometime soon.
And I think some other people brought in, what are the how about autonomous driving? How will that impact? I think that's an interesting perspective. Again, there's the autonomous, then there's some interesting points about personal lifestyle and innovations and using different kinds of mobility. So if you could talk a little bit about autonomous driving, that would be great.
Yeah, autonomous vehicles are coming, but we don't know how fast, and we don't know how autonomous they're actually going to be. If you'd asked me if we had this conversation, say 6-7 years ago, we would be in the midst of the autonomous vehicle hype. And people would still be thinking that they would be introduced commercially at scale by 2022, 2025. That is now increasingly being pushed back. And I think we will also not move certainly not as fast as people were thinking, to what is known as full autonomy. Full autonomy means that your car can drive on its own without any intervention of a driver whatsoever in any circumstance. So it's the algorithms and the technology behind it has learned to adapt to any new circumstance it can encounter. Now, obviously, you can imagine that's quite something. And we're seeing that more and more people become less optimistic that we will actually get to that stage. And more people are now saying maybe we need to be satisfied with reaching the next highest level, which is known often as level 4 autonomy, which basically means that the car, in all situations that it has encountered before, that it has learned about before, that it can then drive on its own, and it doesn't need your intervention as a driver. That's now seen as the most realistic prospect. And we see developments going in that direction, but there are also more and more signs that this is going to happen, possibly first in freight transport and only later in passenger transport. And an engineer working in this field explained it. I heard him explain it in very simple terms. He said to me, well, you have to think about a set of bottles of milk. They don't care if you cut a corner when you turn left or right. Humans do. And I think that's really important, because it gets at the experience of being in that vehicle, the experience of comfort, of safety, and so on. So we're quite demanding as people, of course, and it's not yet quite clear that the technology will be able to deliver the type of experience that we now have with seasoned, competent drivers, which is really interesting, because a lot of the justification for autonomous vehicles is based on the idea that it can take out the faulty human from the equation, that people, they get tired, they lose concentration, they make mistakes all the time, and the technology is superior to that and can actually can avoid these types of mistakes. Electrification is important for automation, because automation is much easier if you have an electric drivetrain, if your vehicle is electric. So many people see electrification as an essential condition for the rollout of automation. And when we're talking about personal transport, we sometimes talk about the holy grail of electric, autonomous, and shared motorized transport, which is kind of the robotaxi I was talking about earlier, this Uber-style service with a car picking you up and driving you autonomously to wherever you need to be. There's a lot of hope that that model will appear, but it's unclear how that model will work in practice. It may well work in medium and high density settings, i.e. in cities. Whether it will work in rural settings in suburbs remains an open question.
Just a few people, various great questions about public transportation and,
Yeah.
you know, how that then goes on to, you know, both what are the different rules that are, you know, either in London or elsewhere, and electrification within the cities, the up in Halifax and other places where, you know, rolling out electrification of buses. So where and how do you see that taking hold in the actual transportation within cities?
Yeah, electrification is often we talk about personal vehicles, but it's just as important in public transport. And particularly when we're talking about buses, it has maybe more air quality benefits than CO2 benefits. So the health benefits are bigger because it reduces the very localized air pollution that you get from congested traffic, especially when that's diesel based or relatively heavy vehicles, as you have with buses. Buses are also easier to electrify and to automate because they're much more standardized than vehicles. But there are two issues. One is that for widespread adoption of electric buses, we need more rapid forms of charging. So you get those technologies are in development, but the costs need to come down before that becomes really practically operational. The other thing is that electric buses are significantly more expensive than conventional buses or LPG buses, which again makes for many bus companies it's unaffordable to buy these buses. Not too long ago, in fact, it was just before the pandemic, I was in an event here in Oxford, and someone from the Oxford Bus Company was there, and they said it's very simple. The business case does not stack up for us for electric buses, and it's very sad to hear. But the price difference is still so large that even if they run their buses day in, day out, they're not able to recoup that additional investment. So again, it's about the economics, the governance, the institutions. That's where, in many ways, the real challenges lie.
Well, Tim, thank you so much. This has really been so great. I think we have probably one more question, and we didn't really get to talk about the sort of the circular economy and even just the resources. They're excellent questions, you know, about mining, and you had touched upon that. So again, appreciate these great questions. Looking at the TSU and your work, what do you see? Where are you most focused and like to concentrate, or what are some of your biggest challenges? And that's a very broad one, but thought we would vert it back to get your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely. That was a really interesting question when I saw it. I think we are increasingly looking at questions of inclusivity of these big changes, for instance, towards electrification of transport. So who is excluded from these processes and in what ways? And how can we ensure that disadvantaged communities, disadvantaged households can benefit from these new forms of transport? And then it's important that we're not only looking at electric cars, but we're also looking at e-bikes, which have huge potential, and in countries like the Netherlands are being sold in very great numbers. They're causing all kinds of havoc on the roads and sort of all kinds of personal safety issues and people ending up in hospital with broken limbs and what have you. But from a transport point of view, they're a really interesting form of transport and can make a form of motorized transport available to people who for some reason are not able or willing to drive a car. And also think about e-scooters, the whole what we call micro-mobility, the idea that that you have small vehicles, e-scooters, e-bikes, dockless bikes, that you have push bikes that you don't own, but that you hire or rent as and when needed. That's a really interesting area as well. So what the potential of these forms of transport is. And then I think it is really, a lot of our work is increasingly focused on these institutional processes. How do you get different government agencies to work together to accelerate these processes? How do you get questions of insurance involved? And we haven't talked about that, but vehicle insurance is completely changing with, certainly with automation, but also with all the new sensors in cars. So the big data is a very interesting development in that regard. It's completely changing all kinds of things. So those kinds of processes. Then there's the question about how do you change behaviors? How do you get people to develop an appetite for moving around in different ways? How also do you make the idea of moving less palatable to people? Because I think that's really important. Technology alone is not going to fix it. We'll need to do other things as well. And that means that we need to probably move away from the idea of having vehicular movement as a right, and it needs to be seen as a privilege. And that's in some ways a step back, if you think about it historically, but it's going to be a very interesting process and something where I think academics, social scientists, amongst others, can make a really interesting contribution.
Super. Well, you brought us through the wide swath of what we know, and I really want to thank everyone who really significant questions. We didn't get to all of them, so we tried to touch upon as much as everyone's good thoughts. But I know here, Tim, I just want to give a round of applause. I know everyone, if they had their cameras on, would be applauding as well. So we really thank you for your time and excited to learn about what you're doing. His contact information is there, and I know some of you have been in touch, but you know, if you have those specific questions, please reach out to him directly. And we just want to say thank you again from the North American office. This is really a wonderful way to hear about your involvement, interests, and connecting you with people, you know, professors like Tim. And we have another series coming. The next series will be on October 21st. Another one, how can we eat without cooking the planet, with Professor Susan Jebb. But I do again want to revert back to Tim and say thank you, Tim. That was really terrific. And thank you all for joining us. We wish you a good rest of the week and stay safe and well.
Thank you very much.